SEAL Virtual Tech Talent Program. And now you know the section we are in, which is the last section of the program. Here we are talking about JavaScript. So for today's class, we'll be focusing on the looping concept in JavaScript, or what you just call JavaScript loops. And so let's quickly view the content we have for today. So today's class, very briefly, is going to be focusing on just looping alone and not any other thing else. And so under the only section we have today, which is looping in JavaScript, we will begin by getting to know what a loop is. So actually, the definition of a loop that we would get to know about, it doesn't just stand that way in JavaScript. It actually cuts across several programming languages too. That's including Python, Java, C, and the rest. So after we talk about the definition, we'd also get to see the different types of loops. Now, as you can see on the screen, there are five different types of loops, although some would say there are two types of loops majorly, which begins with the for loop and the while loop. But here I actually broke it down into five, separating everything from each other. And so we have the for loop first, and it is followed by the for in loop and the for off loop. So you can actually say that the for in and the for or, they are like variants of the for loop. But then the way they work is actually different from the for loop. And we would also see the particular structures that you can actually apply the for in loop in, and also for the for off loop. Now after these three loops, we have the last two, which is the while loop and the do while loop. So generally you can say they are both while loops, but then the do while is just an advanced form of the while loop. So within these different types of loop, we'll be seeing the syntax of each of them, and we'll also see a brief example of each. And after that, you know what's next? We'll have a quick demo on the loops and we'll see how everything works on VS Code. So without wasting time, let's begin with the only section we have for today's class, which is looping in JavaScript. What is a loop? Loop is a programming concept that involves a block of code being executed multiple times as much as it satisfies a particular condition. So this is a very brief, or what I would call a layman explanation or definition of what a loop is. And the fact that this loop, the definition actually sounds almost like conditional statements in a way, but mind you, they are different. They are not the same. Now, here a loop is a programming concept. So this actually means that this particular concept doesn't just happen to be in JavaScript, it also covers different programming languages as a whole. So the loop is just a general concept you would see here. You would also see it in any other programming language you learn. And this concept involves a block of code being executed multiple times. So from what we've been able to do right from when we started JavaScript up until this moment, I would say that so far so good. We've only executed our codes just once. We've not had it run over and over and over and over again with a different output. We've only had the code just run once with one output, and then would have the results displayed on the web browser. But here with the concepts of looping, you can actually run a particular block of code multiple times, and you cannot only just do that, but you can do that with different inputs. So just imagine a particular code running, but each time it runs, the input of that code is something different. It's something different. It's not the same. Yes, the output might look different, but they are all running from the same code that is repeating over and over again. So that's what the concept of looping basically is all about. And now, this particular repeated execution would only continue that way in as much as it satisfies a particular condition. So this means that once the condition set is true, it would keep running and running and running over and over and over again. Now, the downside to looping as a whole is the fact that if you do not set a limitation, it can run infinitely. That means it is going to keep running forever and ever and ever. And I would show you how that actually would happen when we get to a practical demo for today's class. So here, making use of loops is very advantageous when a block of code is required to execute a particular number of times. So the reason for this statement is the fact that while programming, it's possible that you would want a particular code to run multiple times. And the only way this is possible without loops would mean that you would have to repeat the syntax over and over and over again. So just imagine you want to probably display the you want to display objects within an array. Or okay, sorry, not objects. You want to display the elements of an array individually. Now, without loops, the only way you can do that is to reference each of those elements on separate lines. That means you would reference the first one on a single statement, the second one would be another statement, the third would be another statement, and you'd continue to do that till the end of, till you get to the end of the array. Now, it might not really be so stressful if the array just has 5, 10 elements. Of course, you can do that for 5, 10 elements of an array. But what if the array had 100 elements? Does it mean that you'd have to repeat the code 100 times? No, you don't need to do that. And this is why the loop concept here is very, very beneficial and advantageous at that kind of situation. So rather than repeating lines of code, making use of loops would actually make the code shorter. It would also make it faster. And lastly, it would make it more efficient because now you've actually set everything and you've put everything in motion. So the loop would actually know what to iterate over on. You don't need to start repeating codes over and over and over again. Imagine you had just probably an array of 500 elements. That would be so it would be so annoying to actually have a line of code repeated 500 times just because you want to print out the elements of an array. But with the loop, you can actually print every single thing out in a very, very short amount of time. So without wasting much time, on this page you would actually be seeing the different types of loops. And as you can see, the loops in JavaScript can be seen as first we have the for loop, which is followed by one of its variants, which is the for in loop. After the for in loop, we have the for off loop. Now the in here and the off here, they are keywords. So you should know that this cannot be used as identifiers at any point in time. But for the in and the off, they're actually used to do different things. Although they might be so similar when we get to learn about them. But then you would actually get to see where you would apply the for in loop and also where you would apply the for off loop. After this, we have lastly the while loop and the do while loop. Now, these two loops are quite similar, but there is a very, I wouldn't say a very, very strong difference anyway. It's just a very marginal difference. It's just something little, but you'd also get to see the difference between the do while and the while loop as we move on. So we begin with the for loop. Here we have the for loop. Now the for loop iterates over a block of code for a period of time until the condition is not met. So this particular loop would actually run a block of code over and over and over again until the condition becomes false. So this means that when the condition is set and it's true, it's going to run the first time. It will go back and check again. If it's still true, it runs the second time. It goes back and checks the condition again. If it's still true, it runs the fourth time. It would keep on running until it gets to a point whereby it isn't true anymore. And once it's false, it stops. Now, one thing we should note here is the fact that if a condition doesn't exist for the for loop, it's going to run infinitely. And by doing so, it is going to crash your browser. And when it crashes your browser, if you do not stop it on time, the entire memory of your machine, that's your laptop or desktop, would actually run out, and it might cause serious havoc to your whole computer system. So I think I'll be showing you how that actually happens. Hopefully, I'll actually show you how this whole memory, thing would actually get to a point whereby it would run out. Anyway, I'll show that in the demo. So here we have the syntax of the for loop, and it's very, very brief. It begins with the for keyword. After that, you have the normal bracket, which has three statements within it itself. Now, if you notice very well, each of these statements has a semicolon separating it and not a comma. So for the for loop, you would always use the semicolon to separate the statements and not comma at all. Now, after the normal bracket, you have your curly braces. Of course, we already know what that's used for. That's where you would have the code to be executed. So after this brief syntax, I'll get to explain what each of these statements represent. So the statement one here, as we can see on the screen, it actually represents something that we call the variable counter. Now, this variable counter is not very different from your normal variables that we already know about. It's quite the same. The only difference here is that the variable counter is a special type of variable that is used in counting the number of repetitions in a loop. So the variable counter here would actually count the number of times the execution of code is running. But like I said before, the variable counter is just like your normal variable, nothing really special, nothing different. The only thing here is that for the variable to be a counter, there is something that affects it, which we would also see while talking about the syntax of the for loop. Now, this variable counter is to be initialized, and by being initialized, it means you are giving the variable a starting point. Of course, before the loop begins to run, there must be a point where it starts, and then the variable counter runs first before the execution of the first loop. So that means the variable counter would actually run, then after it has run, the execution of the first loop will then begin. Next, we have statement 2, which is followed by statement 1. And this statement 2 represents the condition for executing the code block. Now, I made mention of how important condition is, because without the condition, your code will run infinitely, and on the long run, it would crash your browser. It would also crash your computer system. Now, this condition is always checked each time before the loop runs. So this is another thing that would also be executed before the first loop would actually run. So this means that after the variable counter, the execution would be next, and then the first loop would run. Next, we have statement 3, which represents the increment. Now, this increment is a special type of operator, and hopefully when we talk about operators, we'll still talk about the increment also. Now the increment here affects the variable counter, and it is also executed after the loop. So I made mention of how the variable counter is like your normal variable, nothing different. But what makes it the counter is actually this increment here. So this increment would affect the variable itself. By doing so, it would make it to be a counter, and then this particular increment is always executed after the loop. So this means the order of execution begins with the variable counter itself, then the condition, then the execution of the loop, and then the increment. So that is the cycle at which the entire loop will be going through until the condition becomes false. The moment it is false, it breaks, and that is the exit of your program. So here we have a very, very brief example of the for loop. And as you can see in the statement 1 where the variable counter is, we have that to be let x equals to 0. So the x variable here is actually the variable counter, and it has been initialized with 0. So the 0 here is the starting point of the loop. And remember, for variables you must always declare them. So it's always advisable that you use the let keyword to declare. The var can be used, but then because of the scope, it's always better you use the let keyword. So next we have the condition, and the condition here says x less than 7. So looking at the condition, x represents the integer value of 0, and 0 obviously is less than 7. So this means that after the variable counter has been checked and then the condition has been seen to be true, the statement within the curly braces, that's the document dot write x plus, okay, the x plus double quotes, that's actually like a space. So that would actually give a kind of space between them. So this would actually run, and after this document dot write statement would run, then it would check for the last statement, which is the statement 3. And the statement 3 here has x plus plus. So the x plus plus is an increment, and this particular operator would increment the value of x by 1. So for every loop that is being run, the value of x would always increase by 1, by 1, by 1, by 1. So this would actually output the value of 0. And after it outputs the value of 0, which we have here, the value of x would increment by 1. So the new value of x in the for loop wouldn't be 0 anymore. It would then be 1. But this particular change isn't something you're going to see on your VS Code. No, it won't change on the VS Code. It's just like a change that would happen behind the scenes. That's something you cannot see, but you would know that this value has changed. And so when the x now becomes the value of 1, it would check, is 1 lesser than 7? If it's true, document.write would run again for the value of x, which is 1. So that's why you have 0 and 1 being the output. So this would run even when x is 2, when x is 3, when x is 4, when x is 5, when x is 6. Remember I said after every execution, it would always increment by the value of 1, 1, 1, 1. Now, after x has been seen to be 6, it would increment the value of x one more time with 1, which would mean x now will be 7. But looking at the condition, 7 is not less than 7. And because this is false, this particular code here would not run, and that would be the end of the entire program. So the entire output for this example would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, I know somebody out there might be wondering why I have the document.write instead of the document.get element by ID. Now, the reason why I don't have that one is because the syntax for that is a little bit much, and putting it out here as an example would mean we would have a lot of text on the screen. It might not even contain it, but then I would also show you how this works when making use of the document.get element by ID. So after this, we move on to the next loop. So for the next loop, very briefly, we have that to be the for in loop. Now, for those wondering how you could loop over a JavaScript object, this particular loop will do that for you. Now, the for in loop iterates over the properties of a JavaScript object. So without wasting time, let's see the syntax. And here we have a very brief syntax of the for in loop. It begins with the for keyword, and it also continues with the normal bracket. Now you can see within the bracket we have property in object. The in here is a keyword, and this actually means that it's going to iterate over the properties within a particular object name or a particular object. And so you would also have the codes you would want to execute within the curly braces to run each time it iterates over each of these properties. So very briefly, we have an example here. And as you can see for this example, we created an actual object. So you know already how to do this. This is not new to anyone here. You start by declaring the object with the const keyword, most advisable to use. Then you give it an object name. Here the object name is $obj, that's the object name. And now you begin creating the object. So for this object, we have a key name of A, which has the value of boy, which is a string. We have B with the value of girl. We have C with the value of man. So this particular object has three key value pairs, and the for in loop can actually iterate over the keys of this object as well as the values itself. So you can actually iterate over any of them that you want. So in this example, we are iterating over the keys within the object. So here we began with the for keyword, and we have the key in object. Now this key here can actually be any variable you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be the word key, because the key here in object actually represents the key within the object. Now I know this might be confusing, but what I mean here is this: whatever variable that you actually write here and you continue with in the object name would actually represent the key name within that object. So I could have this to be for x in $obj, for y in $obj. I could even have this to be for $name in $obj. Just make sure that whatever you have here follows the rule when creating a variable name, and it must not be a keyword. Now after this, within your curly braces, you would have your code. And so we have the document.write. Of course, we would actually put out the variable we have in the for statement, which is key, and then we would add a string which would give it a kind of spacing. Now having this to be this way would output the key names in the object, which can be seen as A, B, and C. But in a case where you want to iterate over the values themselves, we already know how to do this using the bracket notation or the dot notation. So this would to iterate over the values of this object, all you need to do is to add the variable that we have here, and then you follow the dot notation, dot the particular object there, or you can use the bracket notation, and then the bracket notation would have the name of the object. So if I'm to iterate over boy, girl, and man, this would actually be document.write, then with the key here, and using the bracket notation would have the $ obj. So this would mean that I should iterate over the keys, the values within the object. So not to be confused, I would definitely show you how this actually works on VS Code. Now, something to note here is the fact that this syntax can be used to iterate over the keys as well as the values of the object. So I already made mention of that, and we'll get to see how that actually happens to be when we get to the practical demo of today's class. Next, we have the for of loop. Now, this particular loop, unlike the for in loop, this one iterates over the values of iterable objects. Now, don't be confused. This particular one only iterates over arrays and strings. So arrays and strings are kind of like the iterable objects we have, and some other ones are maps and nodes. But based on what we've learned so far, we'll only be treating this concerning arrays and strings. So the syntax here is for the for of loop, begins with the for keyword, and here you have values of iterable. Now the values here is actually still any variable you want, or you choose to use, but for me I decided to use value here. And the iterable here can be the array name or the string name. That's the name of a particular variable that has a string value. So this is a very, very brief syntax of the for of loop. Very briefly, not very complex at all. Next, we have a brief example of the for of loop, and we have an actual array that I created. So the array name is $ARR, and it has the value of boy, girl, man, woman. So each of these strings are actually elements of the array. And then for the for statement, okay, I guess this is a typo. Yeah, it's a typo. So this is actually supposed to be value of $ARR and not value in $OBJ. Sorry for that. But just know that it isn't the in that is meant to be here, it's the off. That's the off in this syntax, the off. And then you would have the array name here, which is $ARR and not $OBJ. That's also an error too. And of course, within your curly braces, you would have the document.write, and this would output each element of the array. So this would output boy, girl, man, woman, as much elements you have within your array. So for the next one, we have the while loop. Now the while loop iterates over a block of code as long as a specific or a specified condition is true. Now I already talked about this loop from the very first time we're talking about the contents of today's class, and I made mention that the while loop would run infinitely if a limitation is not set. So some people online actually agree that the while loop is only used when you are running something infinitely. But honestly speaking, I don't think there's anything one would want to run infinitely. I don't think so. So you'd actually have to set a limitation for the while loop so it doesn't run infinitely and crash your computer system. So here we have a very brief syntax of the while loop. It begins with the while keyword, and within the normal brackets we have a condition that we've set. That's the condition we would set would be there. So in as much as this condition is met, the code would have within the curly braces would always execute over and over and over again, and it would run infinitely if we do not set a limitation to it. Next, we have a brief example of the while loop. And as you can see for this, we declared and initialized the variable name of x to have the value of 1. Now, we proceed by using the while keyword, and then within the conditions part, we have x less than 6. So this would actually check if the value for the variable name of x is less than 6. And of course, 1 is less than 6, so this would run. And mind you, this would execute the code we have within the curly braces document.write x. Now, if you notice very well, in the green marker, I actually put there outputs 1 infinitely. And so, yes, this is actually true. Because we did not set a limitation to it, we just purely followed the while loop syntax. And following it directly without giving it where to stop, it would actually output the value of 1 infinitely, continuously, like that till your computer system runs out of memory. When it runs out of memory, your browser or your VS Code will begin to hang. Then something like a deadlock would occur in your operating system, and trust me, that won't be good. You just have to shut down the computer, probably using the power button. But then when you set a limitation to this while loop, you wouldn't have to experience all of that. And so um a very quick thing to add here to stop it from running infinitely is by adding an increment. So this way the value for x would always increment by the value of 1. We already know how to do that using the increment operator. So this will actually increment the value. It will check the condition again. It will keep on doing that until x isn't less than 6. So by doing so, we would actually output the value 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The moment it gets to 6, it would check, and if it's not true, your program would stop. Lastly, we have the do while loop. Now, the do while loop is a little bit different from the while loop, and this is because the do while loop executes the code block once and then checks the condition if true or false before running the code block again. So unlike the while loop actually checks the condition first before running the first loop. But the do while loop would actually run the first loop before checking the condition against the second loop. So that's just basically the difference between the do while loop we have here and the while loop we saw before. So here is a very brief syntax of the do while loop. Very simple. You have the do here, which is a keyword. Within the curly braces, you know what we always have here, the codes to be executed. Now, after this particular code has been executed, it is then followed by the while statement itself, where you would have the condition here. And if this condition is true, the flow of the entire execution will go back to the top and begins executing again. Next, we have an example of the do while loop. Is quite similar to the while loop example since we have the variable name of x being assigned the value of 1. Now, this will actually run the statement we have within the do, within the do section. And so the value of 1 would be outputted first, then it will check the condition of the while statement if it is true. So this means that peradventure we had x to be less than 2, you would only have 1 being outputted on the screen. But if it were to be the while statement, it would have to check the condition first of all before running the first loop. Now, this particular example we have here, it also outputs the first, that's the very very first value for x, which is 1, and it then runs infinitely. So for this not to happen, we need to add an increment which would always increase the value of x by 1, and by doing so we would avoid the code running continuously over and over and over again. Next, we have a quick demo on JavaScript looping. So this is practically the last segment of today's class, and you already know what we'll do here. We'll move from here to our VS Code. So for this, I'll create a new, I'll just call this looping. We'll have our HTML and JavaScript. Okay, so we have everything set now. Next, we'll go on to our JavaScript file and we'll begin putting all what we've learned in actual practice. So we'll begin with the for loop. You already know how this begins. You have your for keyword and the brackets here and the curly braces where we would have our code block to be executed. So for this, we would actually set out a particular condition, would have our variable counter and everything we need to run the entire code. So let's declare a variable counter. I'll call this x equals to 0. Like I said before, to separate them, you must always make use of the semicolon and not comma. You must not use this. Always make use of the semicolon. Next, we'd have our condition x less than 10. And lastly, after this, we would have our increment so it doesn't run forever. So within curly braces is where we would have the code we want to execute. So it will be document.write. Let's just test this. We'll just test this out to see if it runs out. And so for this, I'll be adding a line break. So this way we'll see everything on separate lines. Okay, so this is what the for loop has done for us very quickly. It has iterated over the value of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you can see here that it stops at 9. So this means that the moment it got to where the value for x was 10 and it realized that 10 wasn't less than 10, it exited the program, and that was all. So now that we've tested it and we've known that this works, let's now make use of the document or get element by ID. Now for us to do that, we would have to output this using a variable name, which we would set outside the for loop. So here we would have let $value, which is the name of my own variable. You can use anything you want in as much as you follow the rule for naming identifiers, and would initialize this as an empty string. This is actually a string, but it's empty. The next thing we do here within our for loop would assign this value as a $value, and here we'll be making use of the addition assignment operator. Honestly speaking, we ought to have learnt about operators by now, but no need to worry. We'll definitely look into operators next week. So what this assignment operator actually does is that it adds every iteration of the value into this variable name we have here, $value. So here we'd assign this the value of x. We don't need this anymore. Document or write. Okay, took take this out. And then we'd have our document get element by ID. So for this, we know what we'll do. Go back to our HTML, and then we'll create a HTML tag. We'll give this an ID. I think I'll say para1. Next, we'll have the ID here, para1 dot inner HTML, and this would have the value of $value. Now remember that this particular $value, it would be it's the variable name that would actually hold the value of x for every time it iterates. Okay, so I would also add the br tag here. So we have everything to be on separate lines. So now that we have this should actually give us the same results we had before. Yeah, we still have the same results: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 9. So let's assume I increase this to 11. We should have 10 being added. Yeah, we have 10 now. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 10. Now mind you, if we want to actually put out 11 there, we'd make use of what we call the less than or equal to operator. So this will actually check if the value for x is less than or is equals to 11. And so by doing this, we would actually have 11 to be among the numbers on the screen. Now we have 11. So this is 0 to 11. So this very, very briefly is how the for loop looks when you are trying to make use of, the document or get element by ID, or, get element by class name and all of those. So before we move on to the next loop, one thing I would want you guys to note here is the fact that each of these statements we have here are actually optional. By that, I mean that it isn't compulsory you have it within this normal bracket. And let me explain how that is done. So I'm going to copy this out. And I would also comment this. So for this particular one, we would have the statement one to be optional, or statement one rather would be not present. It's not going to be present in the for statement. We'll have it somewhere else. So what I would do is I'll copy this out and would have it outside here. Yeah. So now we have a code this way. So let's save it and see what happens. I'll change this back to 10. I this to be less than 10. So this should give us 0 to 9 now. And we still have this to be 0 to 9. So you can see that it doesn't give us any error at all. So this means basically that we can have our statement one to be outside the for loop. I mean the for statement, but always make sure that it is present. So let's see what will happen if I comment this out and it's not present here. You can see that nothing would run if it's not present in the entire program as a whole. So here we would uncomment this and this would actually work again. So here we have the values 0 to 9. Now another thing here is the fact that the condition can also be optional, that statement too. So for this, I'm still going to copy this one, or better still, I'll copy this and we'll comment this out. And here, what would be optional would be statement 2 and not statement 1. So statement 2 here is not going to be present. So for this, I'll take this back to where it was. And now we'd have this outside. So now the statement 2 isn't present, and I'm not going to be keeping it outside just yet. So I'm going to save this now. And like I said before, because a condition was not set, you know, things could actually go wrong in the entire program. And so if I go back to the browser, you can see that this particular file is reloading, reloading, reloading. It keeps reloading. It continues to reload. It continues. We can't even see the value for X here. Now, if I should open, probably let me just show you guys what would happen. Tax manager. Here you can see the Microsoft Edge is actually consuming a lot of memory. If we should continue doing this, the memory of this would keep increasing till we get to a point whereby our computer begins to hang, and that's not good. So this will continue reloading, and this is because the operation is still running, it's still running, it's still running. There was nothing set there. So taking out the statement 2 isn't so good. It's always better you have it here. We'll be having it back here. This way we wouldn't have an error. But if you don't want the statement 2 to be here, you could make use of the if statement. That's using the if conditional statement we learnt about last week. So you are going to have the if statement within your code, and then it will actually work out fine. So the last thing we'll be trying out here is statement 3 not being present. and this particular one would make the code run infinitely. So I'm still going to copy this, comment this out. Now we are going to take out the x plus plus out. If we should do this now and I save this, then I open with live server again. Here the document is loading, and this is because the condition we set for the JavaScript file is always true, because 0 is less than 10. So because this is true, this will keep loading and loading and loading and loading. So now if I should open the tax manager, okay, I can't even do that now because my laptop, is hanging now. I just want to show you guys something. You can see Microsoft's Edge here. It's using about 500, 600, 700. The memory storage here, the memory needed to run that particular operation is increasing rapidly, is increasing a lot, is increasing. So of course, because of the memory of my computer is pretty much, this wouldn't, it won't hang. I can easily cancel this. But for someone out there, you might run into serious problem with deadlock. By that I mean your computer would hang badly. So it's always better you have the condition and the increment present in your code. So this way you wouldn't run into issues. So the next loop we'll be looking at is the for in loop. So here the for in loop would iterate over the keys within an object. So for this, I would create an object name, const $sign obj. It would have an object. Okay, call this state. Call this name1. Give this a string of any name. Yeah. Here's our phonemes. And now we have an object. Next thing we do, we make use of the for in loop. So for this, I said you can have any name you want. So I would call this x in $sign obj. And so we'll test this out with the document.write to make sure everything's working fine. And so I'm going to output the value of x here. So this x here should actually give us the name1, name2, name3, name4. And I would add a br to this, so we have this on separate lines. Okay, yeah, so here it has iterated over the names of the key and not the values, just the names. So here we have name one, name two, name three, and as many names we would have in our object, it would iterate over those key names. So for us to iterate over the values, very very simple. I would make use of the bracket notation and would have would- okay, this is meant with dollar sign obj. Okay, this gives us undefined. I'm guessing it's because of this. Okay, this should actually work now. You can see it's not even the same with the original way of referencing objects. Okay, this is not, this looks like it's giving us an issue and I don't know why. Okay, so I'll be checking this with the console.log. Let me run this again. Wow. Okay, so here we don't seem to have an issue. Let's see. Probably need to check that again. Try the dot notation. Okay, so this should give us just the value of that on the screen. Oh, wow, I'm really disappointed this didn't work out. But then for this, it actually just works out fine. Name one, name two, name three, and name four. Okay, so this was actually surprising. But then let's just quickly look at the for off loop. I'll definitely come back to this. So for the for up loop, it's used to iterate over iterable objects, which could be strings or arrays. So I'll create an arrays of cars. Oval view series Toyota. Okay, so we are done here. So I'll use the for off loop to the x. We've already made use of x equals y of cars. Hopefully this should work without an error. Document all right. Remember this is for testing before we get to see how it is done with the get element by id. Okay, I'll comment this out now. Okay, so we have the elements of the array being displayed on the screen. So I'll be adding some spaces to this, or we could just print them on separate lines. by making use of the HTML BR tag. Okay, yeah, so we have the elements of this array, which are the name of different car companies. So this is how you can actually, iterate over the elements of an array. Next, we'll be seeing the one for a string. So for this, I'll create a string xy and I'll call this JavaScript. Next, I will have our for statement again. And this would be, we've made use of y already. Let's just call this z for z of xy. Document dot write for testing too. Call this z plus. We print this on separate lines too. So I'll comment this out. And so now we should see each individual character within the entire JavaScript string being printed out separately. Hopefully this works. Okay, yes, so this actually works. We have JavaScript now, and this actually iterates over each letter in JavaScript. So it iterated over JAVA, then the script itself. So here we have JavaScript being separated. Together, all this was a string, but now they are all individual components on their own. So the next thing here is making use of the document or get element by ID. So I'll comment this one. I'll actually do this first. So I'm going to take out this document or write, and it's still the same process. You would have to declare a variable for this. So this will be let $sign car equals to an empty string. So I think we'll have the array before it and not after. So here we'll have the $sign. We'll make use of the addition assignment operator, which is the plus equals to. This would be y plus br tag. Next, we'll have where we want to output this document dot get element by ID. So I'll have a heading for this here, heading 3 is an ID name of head 3. Comment this out. We don't need this anymore. Okay, so have our ID name here dot inner HTML. And mind you, you can also use the dot attributes or dot style dot whatever styling you want to add to each of these elements within the array. This will be equal to $sign car. And we should expect the results to still be printed out the way it was. So again, okay, yeah, so we still have the same results: Audi, Volvo, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Toyota. So this is a very, very quick way of iterating over the elements of an array. So we'd also use this to, iterate over a string. Comment all of this. We don't need them. So back to the JavaScript string. We'd also have the name here that I want to use to, hold the characters that we iterated over. So I would call this dollar sign string. Remember the dollar sign here would make this a valid, you know, string variable name, despite the fact that we use the keyword of string here. So we'll also initialize this as an empty string. Remove this, we don't need this again. So this will be dollar sign string plus equals to okay, yeah, plus equals to z. Now what this basically means is that in real sense it actually means string equals to dollar sign string plus z. That's what the plus equals to actually means. So for those who might not know about the operators as a whole, we'll definitely touch that next week. But just know that this is actually how to do it. If you set it to just equals to, you would only be printing just one of the iterable letters within the string of JavaScript. Z. Get element by ID name. We can still make use of the head 3. So call it head 3 dot inner HTML. We would output the string itself. And we can also concatenate this if we want. So I would say the letter here is, because you remember would add a plus sign. This will print the letter here is J, the letter here is A, the letter here is V, A, till you get to the very end of the entire, operation. Okay, so this gives us the letter here is J. So I'm guessing this only runs for just this. But let's see. Okay, probably for us to have this, would actually have this not here, would have this here. Yeah, this is where we'd have it. Yes. So this should give us the letter here is this, the letter here is this, and thereabouts. Yeah, so we have the letter here is J, the letter here is A, V. It just, prints out the letter here is, then gives you the actual letter it just iterated over within the entire JavaScript string. So I guess that's that for the for of, you know, loop. So lastly, we have the while loop and the do while loop. So here is the while loop. You know what, we begin with the while statement. And before we do this, we'll actually declare what we are testing for. This will be let xy. Let's just initialize this with 5. I would say xy less than 5, less than 6. So this can be true. Have a document dot get Okay, document or write just for testing. I'll actually print out the value of x, y. Yeah, so this would definitely run infinitely. I'm so sure about this. Okay, yes, so now we have nothing on the screen. And if you look at the tab here where we have this document, it's actually rolling like as if it's loading. And this is because it's running over and over and over and over again. And the reason is because it can't even display, like, it can't display the value of 5 on the screen because the next operation has that same value. The next operation, it keeps on going and going and going and going and going. So I would add an increment after this, which will be xy plus plus. And this should give it a kind of limitation. So when it gets to, you know, the value being 6, it should stop. Okay. Oh, actually, when it got to the value being 5, it stopped. Yeah. Okay, so let me just increase this to 10. So this should stop when the value is 9 of BR. Okay, so we have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So when the value for x became 10 and the condition wasn't true anymore, it's halted. So that's how you have it. So now that it works, let me show you how to do it with the document or get element by ID. It's pretty the same, nothing different here. Would also create the variable name would use to output this. And this would be let call this dollar sign value equals to an empty string. Yeah, I hope you all are listening to this. Okay, good. So hopefully this should actually work the same way. So this dollar sign value would also hold an addition assignment operator. I mentioned why this is important because if you should have only the assignment operator, you would only print out just one value and not all the values it's iterated over. So this would be x plus equals to xy. Okay, you can concatenate this to say the current value is plus. Then we have our BR tag. Document get element by ID. We still have an existing ID name of head 3, inner HTML with dollar sign value. So here we should have the same result, but just with a heading 3 elements. Okay, this runs infinitely. Okay, yeah, I didn't add the x plus plus. Just get rid of this. So it will be xy plus plus. So you can see why it's always important that you add a limitation to this thing. It will always keep running and it could result to a very, very bad error. Okay, so we have the current value is 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I think I'll give this a spacing so it looks more proper. Okay, yeah. So the current value is 5, current value is 6, current value is 7, 8, and 9. So now we've made use of the while loop for this. The last loop we have today is the do while loop. And this begins with the do keyword. It executes the code first before testing the condition. So you have your while statement below here. So the do while loop is quite similar to the while loop. Nothing really different per se. So we'd also have this. I'll copy this. XY is 5. We'll copy this. Still the same code, nothing different. We should still get exactly the same output. Or we might see a difference. Let's see. So here this would run $ values equals to the value of 5. That's the current value is 5. And after it runs this, it then tests the condition below it. So here we would have xy less than 10, still the same. So let's see if we have the same result or something different. But then from the last while loop, we had 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Let's see if we have the same here. It runs infinitely. We did not add an increment. So here's the x plus plus. So this should increase the value of xy. Okay, we need to cancel this. Okay, so it gives us exactly the same result. The current value is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you can see that the while loop and the do while, they are pretty much the same thing. The only difference here is that this particular loop would actually execute this very first output before testing for the rest of this. But then for the while loop, it would actually test everything before you know executing each of them. So lastly, the next thing I'll talk about is making use of the decrement operator. So for this, I would go back to the for loop we started with. And if you notice very well, here where we have this particular loop, the third statement here was actually an increment, but we can also have that to be decrement, which would be x minus minus. But this would not work because x here is lesser than 11. Let's just try it out and see. But normally I do not expect this to play out fine. Okay, so it doesn't work out, and that's because the logic was wrong. So the thing here is this: x here is 0, x is less than 11, which is true, which means this particular code will execute. But then we are now saying it should do x minus minus. So 0 minus 1, obviously it doesn't, you would say it's -1, but I don't think JavaScript agrees to that at all. So the logic here is wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the value for x bigger than the condition. So x here will be 20. And this wouldn't be less than, will now be greater than. So now the logic actually makes sense, because now the value for x is 20. 20 obviously is greater than 11. And then for every time 20 is greater than 11, we would reduce the value for x. So the next time it would run, it would be 19 instead of 20. So I would say, let's just concatenate this. I would say the value current value is current value is 20. So this would actually reduce this until you get to a value that isn't greater than 11. So obviously, when it gets to 11 itself, 11 isn't greater than 11, they are equal. So this particular iteration should only show when the value was 12. Okay, so as expected, we have exactly this. So the current value is 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, and 12. Now it would have printed out 11, but obviously 11 isn't greater than 11. They are equal values, so that wouldn't run. So you can actually make use of the increment or decrement operators. We'll see this again when we are talking about operators. The increment increases by 1, the decrement reduces by 1. Now, mind you, the logic must actually make sense for it to work. So let's assume we change this to x plus plus. What this means is that because 20 is greater than 11, it's going to increment the value of x. So our next value, instead of reducing for us to get to, where the condition will now be false, it will always be true now because it will increase to 21, 22, 23, and we know that values that keep on going like that are obviously greater than 11. So it will continue increasing that way. So let's see. And you can see the entire page is loading. Now, this doesn't mean that our code isn't correct. Our code actually is very much correct. But because the loop is always true, since values greater than 20 and above are actually, greater than 11, to continue increasing the value infinitely. You can see it says here the page isn't responding. So this means our browser is already getting into a very, very tight situation when it comes to the memory it's consuming. So I'll exit this page so it stops. Okay, the exit button isn't working. Oh, okay. Hopefully now it stops. So that's in a nutshell about looping. So basically we've treated the for loop, the for in, the for off, the while loop, and the do loop. So hopefully now we know how these loops work, and you know the particular loop you could use when you want to iterate over a string, over an object, and over an array. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll be meeting in the next class where we'll discuss about operators.